Good morning, let's get started. So today we'll look at the problem of data authentication and the cryptographic primitives to achieve this, MAC algorithms, hash functions, and digital signature schemes. So we first give definitions for the symmetric setting. Symmetric setting we saw in the first lecture that we have hash functions which are keyless compression functions and MAC algorithms which are functions that compress an input under control of a key. And then we'll look a bit also how these are constructed. We look at collision resistance for hash functions, and we look also at authenticated encryption. If there is time left, we'll also discuss secret sharing. So here's an outline in more detail. So we start with the introduction, and then we look at symmetric primitives, so hash and MAC, then asymmetric primitives or public key primitives, digital signature schemes, and then make the connection with protocols. So we first revisit the problem a bit more in detail, and then we look at unkeyed solutions and keyed solutions. So the problem is, of data authentication is, you get a bunch of bits or a piece of software. So something arrives, or you find it on a hard disk, or it's being mailed to you, and you want to find out who is the source of the information. Is this coming from the Ministry of Finance that wants me to pay taxes? Or is this my bank who wants me to call a number and discuss my secret codes with them? Or is this software that I can install? So should I trust the source? I link the data to a source. And of course, you also want to make sure that the data has not been modified. So if you get a code update, you really want to make sure you get the code update that Apple or Microsoft or Google intended, and not some code update with some malware somewhere injected. Same thing if it's a transaction or a payment, you want to make sure the amount is correct and the account number is correct. And then you may want to know when the message was sent, which is actually pretty tricky. We'll come back to that later. But it's not so easy to make sure that the message is actually is not a replay of an old message. And if message is part of a conversation where you have an interaction, it may be a problem that the sequence of transactions is changed. And then you may also want to authenticate that the message is for you. So this is not always done, but and sometimes the keys help you to find out, but is this message intended for me or not? This can also be an aspect of data authentication. So assume that you have some cryptographic techniques and you get a message, you have some keys, you put the whole thing in some cryptographic functions, and the answer is yes, it's okay. If you do this now, and you get the same message a day later, it will also say yes, it's okay, because you have the same message and the same keys, and it's a cryptographic function. Hopefully it gives you the same answer. If your code is not buggy and is deterministic, doesn't start behaving randomly. And that's how you want it. I mean, if you check code today, you get a code update today, you want to check it, and it will say yes, it's correct. And if you check the same code tomorrow, it will also say yes, it's correct. You want to expect the same outcome, correct or incorrect. But if the message changes, makes you to change state, for example, it's a transaction where your payment arrives, you may actually want to prevent that the transaction has effect twice, because otherwise somebody sends you €1,000 or makes you pay €1,000. You can keep sending this again and again. And of course, you don't want to have to pay every time. If it's your account, maybe you want to get the money every time, but then the bank will not be happy that you actually now get €10,000 rather than €1,000. So this is called replay attacks. So sometimes messages can be accepted only once in a certain context. That's called replay, and this you solve normally with transaction counters. So every time you have a bank card, for example, there is a counter in there, and every time the bank card is activated by giving it power, so you enter it into a terminal, then this chip gets a clock and a power signal. The first thing it will do is increment this transaction counter. So every transaction computed with the bank card always has a unique number. And this counts only up. And if it reaches 65536 to the 16, then actually the card stops and you have to get a new one. So that's how you can enforce it with a card. On a computer, it's much harder, or in a virtual machine. because a virtual machine can crash and then come back up, and it doesn't know what actually there was a past or not. Everything is forgotten. So it depends on the context whether this is difficult or not and how you deal with this. There is, of course, other challenges like very long streams. If you have a movie of 3 hours, you don't want to only find out at the end that you watch the correct movie. Okay, that's also in software versioning. Sometimes you may want to stop version rollback. So very often software is updated to fix security bugs. So in many cases you want to disallow going back to an old version, although that's also an authentic version. But so you want to somehow have a mechanism. It's a bit like replay, but similar problem that you want to allow downgrades. And then a really hard problem is when your data is noisy. This is, for example, when you measure a fingerprint or you have a picture of somebody. How do you authenticate this? Because every time you take a picture, it will be slightly different. The light will be different. Maybe the hairs will be different. Your fingerprint, you never get the same thing. And the same problem is happening now at political level. So Europe wants mechanisms to detect child pornography. Well, there is, of course, illegal pictures. You can put them on a blacklist. This is done by making a blacklist of hashes of those pictures. But what if I change a pixel in there? Okay. And there is techniques for this, but in fact they don't work very well. It's very easy to defeat them. And this is what politicians don't want to understand. And actually we can't do this. We can make 2 pictures that look the same but have a very different hash, even if the hash function tries to defeat this. I think I already mentioned clearly that there is applications where you don't want secrecy, where you don't have encryption. For example, if you control a satellite or you control a chemical plant, you say to the satellite, rotate 1 degree, or the chemical plant, open this valve. That's not a secret. Everybody can see the command, and you can see the outcome. But of course, you want to prevent somebody from injecting such a command and taking over satellite or making a chemical plant explode. But there is no secrets there. In many cases, we have secrets, and more or less the message is that if you have secrets, you also have to apply data authentication. So this idea, which you find in all textbooks and in some bad standards, that you can encrypt but not do the authentication, this is completely outdated and it's completely invalid. So if you see somewhere an application, a legacy application that does only encryption but no data authentication, then you have, typically this is problematic. So encryption will not be enough, obviously. If you encrypt stuff, you can flip bits. Think of the one-time pad or a stream cipher. You can just flip bits. It doesn't help, so you don't know what you're flipping, but in fact, you can change as much as you want. Also remember that encryption doesn't hide the length and doesn't hide who's talking, so encryption by itself is not enough. So we have 2 tricks in cryptography. One I already introduced in the second lecture is hash functions. You just have functions that make compute a very complex function from all the input bits, and that retain a short result. So short used to be 64 bits or 128 bits. Even 160 bits today is on the short side. So today we have results of 256 bits or even 512 bits. But any input you give it, and typically there is an upper bound of the input, but it's like 2 to the 64 bytes or so it's kind of exabytes or more. Any input you give is reduced to a short string. And so somehow what you want is rather than protecting this input, you want to protect the short string. So more or less this short string should be a unique fingerprint of your input. Now, you don't have to be a genius in math to understand that these hashes are not unique. Right? This is the pigeonhole principle. If you have 101 pigeons and 100 holes, and you put the pigeons in the holes, then there will be 1 hole with 2 pigeons, at least 1. Okay? So here it's much worse. If you have a huge input space and a tiny output space, so in fact there will be many, many inputs with the same result. And now the game we want to play is that, yes, we know they exist, but you can't find them. So a hash function is designed in such a way that you can't find them. How do you build this? Well, you can try to use clever mathematics like discrete log or so, but this is very slow. Another suggestion is just take random gates. If you make a circuit, which just consists of billions of XORs and ANDs and ORs, and you make a spaghetti, probably you can't deal with it. But it's not so practical, right? I mean, on Intel chip, there is now billions of transistors, but you don't want to spend a quarter of this on a hash function, which is a spaghetti. So the game is, can you make a function that looks easy and elegant, but you still can't find collisions? And it's the most difficult part of cryptography, in my view, because, at least for algorithm design, because there is no secret to hide. So it's like being a magician without sleeves, right? You have nothing to hide. Anybody can compute this function. And so designing this seems to be very hard, as we will see. So, as I said, the hash function moves protection of a large string to a short string, and this is easier. So what you will do is hash the message, and then somehow protect the hash. What I sometimes see, it's kind of shocking, but people still do this. They want to protect the honesty of a message. What they do is they take the message, they hash it, and they send the hash and the message together over the channel. Does that work? Of course not, because the opponent will change the message, recompute the hash, and send that over the channel. Right? So this, I'm not going to tell you names of companies who did this, but I've seen this in my life. You can't believe this kind of thing. So they have heard of cryptography, but they don't know what to do. So what you could do is, as I explained, I think, as an example, you can write down the hash on a sheet of paper and separate it from the content and use the paper. Or like what was done in the 80s in Belgium when the CFO of a company wanted to make a payment. Maybe I should tell you guys, there was no internet in the 80s, right? Not in a company. So in fact, what CFO did, they had a mainframe, and they wrote all the salaries on a tape, a magnetic tape, such a thing. And then there was a courier bringing that to the bank, and the bank also had a mainframe. They would mount the tape, and so this is how they could avoid to have to retype all the salaries. But of course, this guy working for the transport company, maybe he had a friend who worked somewhere for a company with a computer, and he could maybe take the tape and change some salaries. Okay? So the solution is that the CFO should travel in the same car with the guy to the bank, but that's not so practical, so they came up with a better thing, which is they hash the file, and the CFO would read the hash over the phone to the bank. So you have a second authentic channel, verification in person. This was actually a Belgian invention called Trasec, and this was actually deployed in the 80s and used to avoid these kind of things. It's not so scalable and practical, so as you will see today, what we do often is we use signatures, single signatures, to public key mechanism to protect the hash. So that's for the second part, but so you don't want to sign the full document because that's too slow. Public key is 100 to 1,000 times slower, so you hash the document and you protect the result with signature. You can also encrypt the hash, but I think, again, this is legacy, and don't do this kind of stuff. Use a Mac then. Okay, again, it's kind of this crypto bricolage where people, combine things in clever ways. We should really get away from this and do clean primitives with clear definitions and clear constructions. So if you really want to involve a secret key, well, do it then already in the computation. So the properties of a hash are, description is public, so there is no secrets. You can take an input of arbitrary size, or at least very large size, and it reduces it to a fixed length string. So the length is between 128 bits today and 512 bits, and it's efficient to compute. But then it should have T properties. I think it's better to show them on the picture. So first, easy to compute, but you can't go backwards. Given an output, finding an input hashing to this output will be difficult, and of course you can keep trying, right? So if it's as an n-bit result, so if my result would be 4 bits, then I need about 8 attempts, 16 attempts, then I'll have found a solution. But of course, in practice, my result is 128 bits. So in fact, I have to do 2 to the 128 attempts to find what we call a pre-image to invert a function. And that's too much. So in theory, you could try all possible inputs, and you'll find the result, but it just takes too much time. Now, if you look at the example of me protecting my computer files and protecting the hash, or this CFO from the bank, so in fact, if you look at the guy, the courier, he has the files because he has the tape. Okay? And the hash function is known because it was a standard, so the courier can also find h of x. But if the courier wants to become rich, he has to find a second input that is distinct and has the same hash result. Because if he can manage to do that, then the CFO will call the bank, they will read the same hash, but in fact they get a different file, and they will not notice. So we call this a second pre-image. So this is inversion or a pre-image, which means you go from output to input. Here you have one input, and you find a second distinct input with the same result. And it's, in some settings, it's easier because you know a bit more. You have already one input. and it can be easier to find the second one. Of course, if my function was a permutation, then it doesn't exist, right? And there is no second input. But my hash functions are not permutations because they go from a huge space to a small space, so they can't be one-to-one. And on. Again, if my hash function is well designed and there's an n-bit result, I need about 2 to the n attempts to find such a second preimage. And then the third setting is slightly different. Now I have complete freedom, and I have to find 2 different inputs with the same result. And we call this a collision. And it turns out that you can do this in 2 to the n over 2. This is by the birthday paradox. So if you generate 2 to the n over 2 inputs, you have in fact a number of pairs of inputs in 2 to the n over 2. The number of pairs of inputs is 2 to the n over 2 times 2 to the n over 2 minus 1 over 2. So you can ignore this minus 1. So more or less you have about 2 to the n minus 1 pairs. Roughly 2 to the n minus 1. And each pair has probability 1 in 2 to the n to match. So in fact, you expect to find a collision 2 to the n over 2. So it's actually bizarre because it looks very similar to here. The outcome is the same. At the end of the attack, you have 2 distinct inputs with the same result, but here one input is fixed, and here you have complete degree of freedom. Okay. So what do we need this for? As we'll see in November, a good computer system doesn't store your password, but only the hash of your password. This is enough to check it, because once you enter your password, it's hashed, and you can check the result that the hash is correct. So this means that if you break into a computer system, you don't find the passwords in a well-designed system. You can find maybe the hashed password files, and then try to guess passwords and use tools, but in any case, a good system, you don't have the passwords themselves, which also means they can't send you back your password because they don't have it. Okay, they can only give you an option to reset your password, to choose a new one, but they can't actually find your password. So the second preimage, this is the story of the CFO. So you transmit X over a fast but insecure channel, and fast was here magnetic tape in a car. This is still a very high, if you put per gigabyte on this tape, if you look at the speed, in fact, it's very high speed, especially for the 80s, was a very high speed transmission. You transmit the short version, the hash, over a short channel, maybe over the phone. And so the attacker has X, but he has to find the second preimage if he wants to fool the parties. Or same thing, if you want to authenticate the files on your laptop, you hash it. You hash the files on your laptop, write down the hash, and you give the laptop. So you have a second channel. You trust a piece of paper with just the 128 bits or the 20 bytes, whatever you have written down. And you can check authenticity of terabyte files with 20 bytes. So where do you need collision resistance? We'll see a second example later, but the first one is commitments. So in many cryptographic protocols, you choose a value and you want to be bound to this value, but you don't want to leak it yet. And a very good example is an auction. Right? People buy stuff on eBay here. So on eBay, you see something, maybe you need a new bicycle, and you see a bicycle there, and you say, okay, look at this bicycle, I'm going to start a bid of 25 euros, I will increment in 5 euros up to 45 euros, it's not worth more, it's really crappy bike. But then, of course, if you want to do this with cryptography, you have to bind yourself to this bid, but in the beginning you don't want to reveal it. Right? So what you do is you send the hash of the bid. And then afterwards you can open this. So this is what is, for example, used in voting schemes, but also in auction schemes and so on, but also in other protocols. So you want to, we call this a commitment. So, of course, if you think about it, it's not very secure because, you see this bike and you know that the value will be either 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 50 euros. So you can try all the hashes and then you find what the guy committed to. Okay? To solve this, you will actually combine X with a random value of 128 bits and you will hash it as your commitment. Okay? And then you send to the other party the hash of this random number and the input, say the bit. And then later on, when everybody sent in their bits, you can then reveal your commitment. So you can then show X and R, and you can no longer change your mind. So you're first bound to the value, but you don't reveal it. It's like sending something in an envelope that's closed. So I think it's now getting abolished, but For public tenders, you worked with the government, you had to send an envelope, a sealed envelope, and they would say on Monday, the 1st of October, at 10 o'clock you can come to the office in the ministry and then they will open all the envelopes together. That's a bit not environmentally friendly, so today you could send your hash of your document and then you can show up and send afterwards a document, but it actually shows you are bound to it already when you send the hash. And of course, if you would be able to find the collision, so two distinct inputs with the same result, then you could actually decide how you open it. So first you look at the bits of your competitors, and then you can decide whether you show X or X prime. So for a secure commitment, you should not have collisions. Okay. And of course also, what should happen, not be possible, is finding from H of X, because then somebody looks at the commitment and can find out what you actually bit. So this is, you need per-image resistance, but also you need collision resistance here. So this is the two properties you need. So I think we discussed the Berti paradox already. So collision resistance is hard to achieve, and it's kind of surprising. So what does this mean in hash function design? So, well, if you have per-image source, if you use 128 bits, it will take $10 million for 8 billion years, so this seems to be quite secure. Okay, 2 to the n, where n is 128. It's like keys, right? 60 bits, PhD student, 80 bits, the NSA, 90 bits, even the NSA will struggle, and then beyond that, you see the kind of numbers. So even if the NSA budget is $10 billion, they can't wait for 8 billion years. They're not so patient. They'll find a different way to hack your system. But now it turns out that in many settings, there is many targets. And this is something very often overlooked in cryptography. So think of, for example, the password files. I mean, imagine that you break into a system and you find all the hashed passwords. For a hacker, it can be enough to break one password, because then they have access to the system, they can log in, and then they can try to do privilege escalation, try to become root, and then really take control. But they only have to get in with one account. Okay? Now imagine there is 1 million accounts. It turns out that finding one password is then 1 million times easier. I think of, I have a cup here, and I put it in the auditorium, and I have a ping pong ball, I have to hit it. This can be very hard. But if you put 200 cups here, and then you give me a ping pong ball, well, after a few attempts, the ping pong ball will be in the cup. So in fact, this is very high security if you're looking for only one target, but if there is a huge number of targets, billions, for example, well, then the security will drop very quickly. It's not so secure as you think it is. Okay. And then the search for collisions is much easier. So for 128 bits, this is clearly good enough for pre-images. Even if there is many targets, it's still, I think, okay. $10 million for 7 years, okay. If there is a huge number of targets, this is quite a huge number. This is a trillion targets. This is a bit exaggerated in general. This is like, a huge cloud maybe has 1 trillion files or so, right? But collision search for 128 with $10 million, you can find a collision in 15 seconds. Okay, even for 160 bits, it's 11 days. So if you really want long-term security, you need a 256-bit hash result, and then you have 128-bit security against collisions. So how do you build a hash function? Well, I would say get a PhD in it. It's very tricky, and my advice is also publish your hash function just before you get your PhD, because there was a large hash function competition in 2008, resulting in SHA-3, and the opening, so the presentation of all the candidates was in Leuven, 2009, I think, and there were like 56 submissions, and by the summer, half of them had been broken. People had found collisions already. For some, you could just, there were really bad designs, you just took an input and you flipped some bits and you found the collision already. So it was kind of, But it's tricky. So what people do is, it's very difficult to design a function that takes arbitrary length inputs. So you try to first move the problem to a function that takes fixed length inputs, say a 1024-bit block X and a 256-bit input, and compresses again to 256. Right? So this H values here are 256 bits, and the X values are 1024 bits. So this is called a compression function, so it actually reduces 1024 plus 256 to 1024. Then you divide your message up in blocks. You start with a starting value, which is 0 or so. This is public value. It's not like a secret IV. It's the digits of pi, or it's all zeros. and you take x1, the first block, and IV, you get h1, then you take the next block, and h1, you get h2, and so on, until you're at the end, and then the good thing is to then do something special, and then you're done. And so this is how you can deal with arbitrary length inputs, because now you can hash 1024 bits, but also 1024 bytes, and a megabyte, and a gigabyte. You just make a very long chain, and you hash. Okay? There is many things you can do wrong here. So one problem is, what if my message is 1000 bits? My first block is 1024 bits, so you add 40 bits. But how do I know now that the message ends with 40 bits? So in fact, you can say, well, it can be a message of 1024 bits with 40 bits, or maybe one with 1025 bits with 30 bits. I found already a collision. Okay, so you have to do something we call padding. So what people do in practice is you put always a 1 at the end, and then you put some zeros, and then you fill out the block with the length in bits of the message. We call this as an unambiguous padding rule, so you know where the message ends and you know how long it is. So you append the length, and then you hash block by block. And so also, I think since about 15 years, we know that at the end you should do something special, which people did not do in the beginning. But modern designs do this. So the research in the 80s focused on, if I have a block cipher, because we had a block cipher at the time, DES, that was the only block cipher available. It's maybe hard to imagine to you guys now. There is hundreds of block ciphers. You can go to Wikipedia and find hundreds, but in the 80s there was only one called DES, or triple DES. And so people looked at how can you make a hash function from a block cipher, and the idea is that if you add the plaintext to the ciphertext, well, if you try to invert this function, it becomes very hard because, you have this value here. If you want to decrypt, you have to know the key, obviously. This is the key input of DES. So you have to choose the key, but then, to find then the ciphertext, you have to actually guess what the plaintext is. So it's kind of tricky. Nobody knows how to solve this. It turns out you can also swap things. So this is Matthias Meyer-Ozia. This is Davis Meyer. This is a scheme I designed where you actually also feed forward the key, which is sometimes better as well. So this is a way you can turn a block cipher into a compression function, and a compression function can then be turned into a hash function. There is a new way, which is SHA-3, which was designed in this building. A different philosophy. Say we don't have a block cipher, so a block cipher is a permutation which has a message input and a key input. And so, for example, for AES, the message input is 128, and the key input is 128 or 256 bit. But what if you can, in fact, we don't need this key input. A more elegant solution is to just take a permutation. For hashing, you actually never have to decrypt, so why should you have a key to allow you to go backwards? So the idea is to just have a large permutation, and then start with zeros. You XOR the first message block, and you apply the permutation. You XOR the next message block, apply the permutation, and so on. You keep going. And then at the end, what you do is apply one more permutation, and you take the output. You select some output bits. And in fact, this is called a sponge, because it has some very nice properties. So the idea is here you absorb the message, and then here you squeeze the message. So here you pour water in the sponge, and then here you squeeze. And the nice thing is you can keep squeezing. So if you take a hash function designed like this, the result is fixed and is 256 bits or 512 bits, and that's it. Okay. But here, in fact, you can keep squeezing, and if you want a hash result of 3,000 bits, that's also possible, or 9,000 bits. And some applications actually need this. We call this a XOF of an extendable output function. So where you can actually decide to also want a longer hash value. So it can be a fixed standard value like 512, but you can also have 513 or 3,902 or whatever you want. This is the nice property of this. I will not go to the details, but if you would XOR the input to everything here, then it would be insecure. Okay, then you can see that it's easy to invert things, and you can break it very easily. So the idea is that part of the input of the permutation is not controlled by your input, and the other part is controlled. And this bottom part we call the capacity, and so your security level depends on this capacity C, on the number of bits which you don't XOR your message to, or which you don't output. And so the nice thing is also that you fix a permutation, and then you can choose a capacity varying, And if your capacity is small, you have a higher speed but less security. If your capacity is large, you can see the formulas are getting better, but your speed becomes lower because you can process fewer bits. So it's actually a very elegant and nice design. And so some modern designs now use this approach. By the way, also this approach, it's a bit of a problem because even if you use AES, then your result will be at most 128 bits. And that's not enough, as we showed you, for collision resistance. So you have to do more clever things and more complex designs. This design is much easier. So the Ketchak design uses this principle. It's called SHA-3. It's just not incredibly popular because the permutation goes from 1600 to 1600 bits. And this is part of how it was designed. Now, you can imagine that Intel and AMD and ARM, they hate an input of 1600 bits. Right? It's just not a power of 2. The registers are 64, 128. What is this 1600 here? Right? It's kind of annoying. If you would build special hardware for this permutation, it would be blazing fast, but if you do it in software, there is tricks, but it's kind of tricky to deal with it. It requires quite some register space. Okay, so I'm not going to give you the whole story, but more or less, as I said, there is many broken hash functions. It's a graveyard full of hash functions. And so, in fact, the amazing thing is, I think it's this graph here. You see here the number of bits, so it says 80, it means it takes 2 to the 80 steps to find the collision. And you see here MD4. MD4 is designed by Ron Rivest, the R in RSA. And he made MD4 in 1990. It was a very interesting algorithm because it was the first software algorithm. So really focused on software like RC4, but it was tuned towards 32-bit machines. So Rivest understood that if you want cryptography to be fast, if you don't have special hardware, like we have with AES, or with maybe in the future with SHA-3, you should use the existing instructions on a RISC processor. Because every processor, this processor from the 90s was a simpler processor than Intel. It had simple 32-bit registers and simple instructions. And he used them in a very clever way. It was a very fast cryptographic algorithm. Okay, it was 10 times faster than DES, so people really liked it. But collisions were found after 6 years by Hans Dobertin. And then in 2004, a Chinese professor came to our conference, Crypto, in the summer, and she showed how to write down collisions for MD4 by hand. Okay. Now, already people realized in 1990 that MD4 was not so secure. They actually used MD5. MD5 was one more round, and Rivest said this is really secure. Already after 1 year, we had an EU project where we showed that there was a problem with MD5, but people said, yeah, well, it's okay. And then after 5 years, the company RSA said in 95, we really should not be using MD5. Stop using it. And then Professor Wang showed up at Crypto 2004, and she found collisions for MD5 in 15 minutes on her PC. This was kind of a cryptographic meltdown, okay? And Microsoft actually looked at their systems, and they found 800 users of MD5 in Windows. So they hired a person called the MD5 removal person, and their job was to remove MD5 from all the Microsoft products. We now know this person failed miserably, because in 2013 there was an attack on a Microsoft product where MD5 was used to protect code updates. And the NSA managed to find collisions for this code update and put malware on people's devices. Okay, so the warning came, first warning in 93, and the attack was 20 years later. Now let's come in the NSA. I was in a meeting in Paris in 93 discussing hash function standards because it was my PhD topic. And the NSA guy said, I wish I had a recording of this. MD5 is the work of an amateur. So more or less, this guy from NSA calls Ron Rivest, Turing Award winner, Professor MIT, an amateur. The NSA are the professionals. They design SHA-0 and say, this is what you do. Here is our design, accept it. After a year, they said, oh, we made a mistake. Here's a new version. This is called SHA-1. The previous one was SHA-0. This is better. So why would we change it? Oh, we can't tell you, it's classified. So in 97, people found serious problems in SHA-0, and Professor Wang found collisions for SHA-0 in 2004. Even worse, Professor Wang found a method for collisions for SHA-1 as well. So the NSA was also in the camp of the amateurs, okay? And I'm also in this game because I designed RIPE-MD 160 in 96, and RIPE-MD 160 is still unbroken. And it's used in Bitcoin. Okay, so now we see who the amateurs are and who the professionals are. But so what do people then use? Well, they use SHA-2, and who designed SHA-2? The NSA. Which I'm baffled by this because they have proven incompetence, SHA-0 and SHA-1, but still people trust the NSA. But I mean, you should imagine this. There is a widely used primitive. Many lessons are to be learned. So if we say don't use it, people ignore it anyway because it was fast and cheap. It was free and fast. Second, if you then told remove it, well, it will take 10 years. And so I told you on Monday about post-quantum crypto and removing RSA and ECC. It's going to take more than 10 years. Right? So this is a very big problem. We have now close to like 80 or 90 billion crypto libraries and devices everywhere, replacing them all. 10 years will not be enough. So you can have a job for at least the first half of your career. I swear that some of you by 2040 will still find of broken public key crypto in everywhere. Okay, this is more or less the lesson we learned or we didn't learn, but at least this is important information to see. So what should you do? So don't use SHA-1. The interesting thing is that, in fact, Professor Wang showed there was a problem, but then 5-minute collision was still quite expensive. It was supposed to be 2 to the 80. It took, in the end, 2 to the 63, but it took us still another 12 years. Why? Because it was pretty tricky. And also, 2 to the 60, I told you today, a PhD student can do it, but in 2005, in fact, it was very expensive to do, and people couldn't do this. So in the end, it took longer, but then the collisions were found. And by the way, there is still banks that have their whole infrastructure still in part based on SHA-1. Although the warning from SHA-1 is also now 19 years old, the banks are still migrating away from SHA-1. Okay. So there is RIPE-MD 160. This is not broken, but it's only 160 bits, so it's not usable for collision resistance anymore. There is Whirlpool, designed by Vincent Ryman, also unbroken. There is SHA-2, designed by the NSA, and it's not broken either. It has a whole series of algorithms with different output lengths. The one I like best is this one. So you have the 512-bit state with a 256-bit output. It gives you quite some advantages. And then there is the SHA-3. This is actually based on a sponge. This became a standard 2015, but there is still no wide deployment. Because if you really want to make it fast, you should have hardware. And I think Intel and AMD, they've spent all their effort making SHA-2 fast on their processors. But I think eventually people will switch to SHA-3 because it has many advantages. Okay, so that's about the hash function disaster. Things are a bit better. Yes? Well, I mean, you should remember this was designed in 1996, okay? And we thought this was enough for at least 10 to 15 years. And maybe it's hard for you to imagine now, but in the 90s, crypto just moved to software. Performance was everything, okay? And we didn't, I mean, we made a version which is 56 bits, but we're not really standing behind it. We think it's not enough analyzed and it's too risky. And I think in the end, I think the SHA-3 principles are much nicer than keeping continue on the, I mean, you could do it now. You could probably make a better version of RIPE-MD, but my co-author passed away at a very young age and kind of, anyway, at that moment, I mean, once we realized there would be a new design, there was actually the SHA-3 competition, and then we decided not to what we had, we would not be extend because we preferred to go to we supported the things like permutation-based stuff. Okay, but yes, we could have done this, and there is still tricks to do this, but I think the SHA-3 design is more elegant and is more scalable. So it is still, many principles there are from the early 90s, and our insights on how to design algorithms change. Okay, so if you have a key, then the story is different, so it's easier to design. So you want to make a function now that can be easily computed with the key, but if you don't have the key, you can't predict the output. That's more or less what you want. And then you move protection of data to protection of keys. So Alice and Bob share a secret key. For a clear text message, they append the MAC. And then Eve can modify the message. But Eve doesn't have the key, so she doesn't know how to modify the short MAC string. So the best she can do is just put a random string there, but that's not going to work. Well, at least not with high probability. So here you move authenticity of data to secrecy of keys. So you first assume you have a key. So description is public, but there is, of course, a secret parameter. Again, arbitrary length inputs to a fixed length output. The banks used 4 bytes, but this is now disappearing. We actually still use max of 8 digits. So every time you have, you log in with multi-factor authentication and you have 8 digits, this is actually a MAC value. And as you can see, cryptographers are not big fans of this, 6 or 8 digits. 6 digits, that's about 20 bits key. And 8 digits, that's 26-bit key. So you can spoof this very easily by just writing a script and trying all possibilities, right? I mean, all the MAC values you can just try. So how do you defend against this? You say, oh, this user tried to log in 10 times. I'm going to delay him or her more and more, and in the end, I'll block the account. But what you can still do is try a few MAC values for all the users. If there is 1 million users, you can still try 5 values for each of them. You have 5 million attempts, and you will get in. So short MACs are not good. You need at least, I would say today, 64 bits, at least. But we still use short values. Why is it so short? Because the ones you have to type over in multi-factor, of course, people don't want to type. I mean, it would be secure to have 64 digits, but that's 25 digits, right? Nobody wants to type 25 digits to log in somewhere. So if you have the key, it's easy to compute. If you don't have the key, you can't actually predict it. So even if you look at many inputs and outputs, if you don't know the key, and I give you a new input, you can't predict what the output will be. So it's kind of an unpredictable function. That's what it is. If you manage to do this, we call this a forgery. So you produce a MAC value for a new input. In practice, all MAC algorithms are pseudo-random functions. This is a function which is more than unpredictable. It's actually completely random. So more or less, you look at the output bits, you can't tell them from random. What's the difference? Say that you could have a MAC with an output of 200 bits where bits are pairwise equal. Okay, that's still unpredictable because you have to predict 100 bits to find the 200-bit MAC, but it's not random. Okay, or you can have a MAC where the first output bit is always 0 and then you have 100 random bits. That's not random because it starts with 0, but it's still hard to predict because you have to predict all the bits. So more or less, the random function is a MAC where it's hard, every bit is really random, and this is what we design in practice. So in practice, if we need a MAC, we use a pseudo-random function. So as I mentioned, what we use in practice is short MACs sometimes, but on the internet is 96 bits, and then the keys, people used to use single des for MACs, and then change the key all the time. This has been disappearing. Now people use triple des. So this is 112-bit keys or AES 128-bit keys, or tricky triple des 168-bit keys. So you can always guess the MAC. Okay, so Eve wants to attack the system, she can just change a message and put a random MAC. It's like if you have to defeat a multi-factor authentication, you ask for a 6-digit code, you just type in a code, and you hope you'll be lucky. Okay, so what is your chance of success? It's 1/2 to the m, where m is the number of bits in the MAC. So if my MAC is 32 bits, I will be correct with probability 1 in 2 to 32, 1 in 4 billion. Okay. Now, some banks use 64-bit MACs with 56-bit des keys. Okay. In that case, it's actually better to try to first guess the key and then compute the MAC. That's a better strategy. So in fact, if 1/2 to the k is larger than 1/2 to the m, then if your key is shorter, then it's easier to first guess the key and then compute the MAC. So it's actually quite stupid to do that. So your key should be at least as long as your MAC value. Otherwise, you first guess the key and then compute the MAC. As for encryption, you can also try to just compute the key by trying all possibilities. And for this, you need a number of text MAC pairs. You have to have enough equations. So in fact, a MAC algorithm, what is known is the input and the output, and the unknown is the key. So more or less, every MAC value gives you m equations, bit equations on the key. Right? If your MAC is 32 bits, then you can write down equations. You have 32 bit equations on the key. So if my key is 128 bits, I need at least 4 of those equations to have enough information to have a unique solution. Right? if there is only 32-bit constraints you have, you'll never be able to find unique solution. So the number of constraints you need, or equation you need is, or pairs you need is k over m. So you have actually, every pair gives you m equations. And if you have k over m pairs, you have k equations in the key bits. And more or less statistically, there will be a unique solution. So I collect k over m text MAC pairs. And then the number of attempts is 2 to the k minus 1. So I just try all possible keys. And then I have a unique solution. And then it's a bit tricky. I will not explain the details, but the way we construct MAC algorithms, so some work we did in the mid-90s, we showed, in fact, that the birthday paradox also applies to the MAC. So if your internal state is n bits, if you have 2 to the n over 2 known messages and a number of chosen messages, you can actually forge MACs. So somehow your security of your MAC does not depend on the size of the state, but the square root of the size of the state. And this was a bit of annoying to the banks because the banks used MACs based on triple DES. And there the block length is 64 bits, so their state is 64 bits. So more or less, if you saw 4 billion messages, you could create new text pairs. So this is a bit of a problem, but I will not explain the details. So the banks, they still use today CBC MAC based on triple DES. And I show you CBC MAC. On the internet, people use HMAC based on MD4 first, and then quickly MD5, and then based on SHA-1, and now based on SHA-2. Okay? So the idea was there, if I have a hash function, I can make a MAC, and it is faster than using DES, which was quite slow in the 90s. So AES only was created in 2001. Okay? And then I will also explain you what also GMAC is being used. This is actually a very cool idea. So let's look at this. Let's first this is what ANSI retail MAC is. So use triple DES. So normal people would use triple DES in CBC mode, okay, and you keep the last block. Now the banks always want to save. So in fact, they only use single DES, and then in the last part, they go to triple DES to save a few encryptions. It doesn't save much because these transactions are like, 3 or 4 blocks. A bank transaction has a few strings of 32 bits, is not a megabyte. A bank transaction is 60 or 100 bytes. So it turns out, in fact, that if you do this, what you can show that if you have 4 billion messages, then the security reduces to single DES. So it's actually not a very good design. That's an attack I found. A better way to do stuff today is with AES. So AES is a 128-bit block length. So this means it has much more robust security. This birthday paradox stuff is to the 64. Okay. So you just do CBC with AES, and then you have to do something special in the last step. Just like here, there is some cryptographic reason. You have to do something special in the last step, otherwise there is attacks possible. Here, something special, which I recommend, is use a different key. But the industry prefers another solution where you use the same key here, but you XOR a different key in the last block. And for some implementation, this is indeed better. But it has, again, it's not as secure, as robust, but that's what it's called CMAC. By the way, there is so many MAC schemes that the whole alphabet from AMAC, BMAC, CMAC, DMAC has been taken. So we have to find new names. So there is many variants of the designs. I just show you a few here. But you get an idea what's kind of possible and what people do. So they use a block cipher to create a MAC. The internet people don't like this design because it's serial. Okay, you can only, just like CBC mode, you can only start this encryption when this one is completely finished. So on modern processors, you can't really fully exploit the processor. And so CBC MAC is eventually also going to disappear. If you do a contactless transaction, the banks use CMAC. Okay, CMAC is the variant of LMAC where you XOR the key here. That's contactless. If you have a contact transaction, so you put your chip or your card in the terminal, then it's triple DES. So maybe hard for you, but let's go back to 1990. In 1990, there was actually only DES and RSA, and RSA could hardly be implemented because it took probably like 10 seconds to do an RSA computation on a processor, 10 seconds or 30 seconds, something like this. And then there was DES and triple DES, and that was it. And about Diffie-Hellman. Nobody had designed block ciphers. There were some stream ciphers, but they were proprietary, so you had to secret designs, and that was the world. It was very easy to learn all cryptography because there was only very little in the public domain. And then Rivest comes with MD4 and MD5, and so they were much faster. They were oriented towards software, 10 times faster than DES, plus they were not encumbered by export restrictions. So you could not take DES code on a floppy disk. There were no USB sticks. You know what a floppy disk is? But so if you took DES code on a trip to Europe, you probably would be arrested at many borders. Okay, so this is more or less, exporting DES was a sin. So then comes this hash function, which the secret services didn't mind so much because they don't do encryption, they only hash, and they were faster. So people said, let's make a MAC out of hash function. So the first idea was to put a secret prefix method. You put the key in the beginning and then you hash. This has a big problem because if you look how hash functions are made, once I give you a hash, I can actually append as many blocks as I want and update the thing without knowing the key. This is called extension attack. This is why in modern hash functions you do something special at the end to stop such an extension. But the hash functions at the time, MD4, MD5, RIPE-MD, we don't have protection against this. So it's kind of a bit bizarre, but it's a no-go. Yeah, what you do next is then, if it doesn't work at the beginning, let's put the key at the end. Okay? This is a terrible idea because if you now have a collision for the hash function, you can have forged MACs because then you know what happened before doesn't matter, and now you can just, if you have a collision, you can ask for one MAC and then get the other one for free. So it's very good we could stop this. So then people, what do they do next? Oh, you put the key at the beginning and the end. And then the theory people came in and they wrote a paper showing this was provably secure. It became an RFC, request for comment, and then we broke it. So we showed more or less that if you do it like this, if you have enough messages, you can find collisions, and then you can find all the bits of the key step by step rather than trying them all at once. So, okay, fourth attempt is HMAC. So again, it has security proofs. It's probably secure, but the security proofs are still a bit doubtful. So in the sense that they make quite bizarre assumptions. But more or less what you do is use the prefix method. So you take K1, your key, and your message, you hash this, and this becomes a new message, and then you hash this with K2 as prefix, and that's it. That's HMAC. I made a better design, but people didn't like it. Because this design has the advantage that you don't have to change the MD5 function. Right? You could use the MD5 calls and changing the inputs. I wanted a design where you had keys everywhere in MD5, but people didn't like that. So this is what's the standard is still being used. But of course, as I told you, MD4 was broken, MD5 was broken, SHA-1 was broken. So now you have to start using this with SHA-2, and then it becomes a bit less efficient. With MD5, it's very efficient. With SHA-2, it's in fact, then you're better off with CBC MAC, more or less. So you will see the disappearance of HMAC in the next 5 to 10 years. But it's still everywhere, and there is probably in Windows 800 users of HMAC now. I just hope it's not HMAC SHA-1. But it's no longer really very efficient. By the way, if you use a sponge function like SHA-3, you can, of course, this is a hash function, so you can use it like this, but that makes no sense whatsoever. So in fact, there is a mode where you take the sponge, you put the key in the beginning, and in the sponge setting, it actually works. That's called KMAC. And once you have hardware for SHA-3, then you will also MAC based on SHA-3. It will be faster than everything else. So I think it's interesting to see how cryptography moves. So in the 80s, everything was based on DES and triple DES. In the 90s, everything was based on MD5. In the zeros, everything was based on AES. And of course, SHA-2, which is the ugly old stuff still remaining from the NSA. And so my prediction is that probably in the next 10 years, we will move to everything based on SHA-3. We'll keep AES still, but if you actually would have hardware for SHA-3, it will be much faster. And there is also a design ASCON, which won the lightweight competition. It's actually very nice. It has the same principles as SHA-3, but it has a 512-bit block, which the industry likes much better, actually. So it has other trade-offs in terms of security, but it's more tuned towards modern processors. But so as Architectures changed, so DES was designed for hardware, MD5 was designed for software, AES was kind of both, and now we will move to new principles because we just design things differently. But it keeps changing. So in the 70s, Gus Simmons, this is a researcher, a very cool guy. He was actually working at Sandia National Labs. This is a lab where they work with dangerous things like nuclear bombs. And he was working on nuclear test treaty, bans of nuclear tests. And so the problem he was facing was, how do you enforce this? So the solution is the US puts in the Soviet Union some equipment and sends the measurements to the US. Okay? Now, what is the easy attack? Well, you just, as the Russians, you do explosion and you forward the signal. So Gus Simmons said, I need a Mac. He understood this, like the banks have a Mac. So he went to the NSA and said, I need a Mac. It's good. The NSA said, we can do that. What are you going to do with it? Oh, I'll put it in a box and ship it to Russia, the Soviet Union. What did the NSA say? Go to hell. You think we're going to give you crypto, which you're going to ship to the Soviet Union? This is never going to work. Right? We don't give our crypto to the Russians. Will break it open and learn from us. So then Gus Simmons invented the one-time path for authentication. So he more or less found out that you can have unconditionally secure authentication, which means you have a Mac, and if you use your key only once, you can prove security. Okay? Now, in the one-time path, your key has to be as long as your message for encryption. For Mac algorithms, it's worse. Your key has to be at least twice as long as your message if you really want perfect authentication. But then people found out later, in fact, you can have imperfect authentication, which is still very, very good with a short key. Okay? But you have to use your key only once. And one of the simple schemes is this one here called, it's just actually a polynomial. It's arithmetic not over integers, but finite fields. If you took the discrete algebra course, you know what this is, but it's just calculating with bits more or less. And it's very, very simple. You just have two keys, key 1 and key 2. They're 128 bits each. You divide your message up in 128-bit blocks. And in fact, your Mac is a polynomial evaluated in key 2 with a constant term key 1. Okay, so this is what you use. And in fact, this gives you provable security. Your key is 256 bits, and you have a 128-bit Mac. And the security level is something like 64 bits to 80 bits. Provable. Okay. Now there is a problem. The problem is that this operation here, this multiplication, is a special operation. And the way people implemented this is with tables. Okay. Now you can implement this with tables, but then of course it's very annoying that your key K2 changes all the time. Because if your key K2 changes all the time, you have to compute new tables all the time, and you don't gain much. Right? If for every message you have to compute new tables, then computing the Mac will be too slow. So what did the people in standardization say? Let's be cool, we can reuse K2. Because in fact, we think it's okay. Of course, it's not okay, but they just pretend it's okay. So they reuse K2. And of course, K1 is not random. What they do is K1, they actually use AES in counter mode. So they have a nonce for the message, and they encrypt the nonce with the key, and this is K1. So this is different for every message. And then the key, they just compute once and they reuse. And this is called GMAC. And if you combine it with counter mode, you have GCM or Galois counter mode. And then came Intel, and Intel said, this is fantastic, we like this. Well, OCB mode is better, but it's patented, so let's just build hardware for GCM. So then Intel built hardware for this multiplication, and now GCM is very fast. I'll tell you a secret, now there is no reason to reuse K2 anymore. Right? Because if you have a multiplication in hardware, you don't have to compute tables anymore. And so in fact, you could use a different K2 all the time. But of course, we don't do that because the standard was fixed and we now keep reusing K2. So what is the problem? It's very simple math, but if you reuse the counter in GMAC, so somehow you make a mistake, your library reuses the counter, then you get the same K1. And now what you find is two Macs, which are just equations, polynomial equations in K2, and you can just solve the equation and you now find K2. So if you reuse the nonce, your security is completely gone. Okay, it's a bit like the Venona problem, right? This is a fantastic scheme if you use your key only once. And you don't have to have random keys, you can make them with the counter mode. But here key 2 is being reused, and this is actually a disaster. By the way, the same scheme is used in 3G, 4G, and 5G, and these people are smarter. They don't reuse the key K2. Okay, so you can actually use GMAC properly, but NIST doesn't do it. So now you know why I'm not a big fan of this NIST standard. And researchers said it's going to go wrong. People will make libraries where key 2, the nonce is reused, and guess what happened? People made libraries where the nonce was reused, and then the key K2 leaked, and you could actually break the system. Okay. So as we mentioned in the second lecture, in practice now we made progress. So we don't design encryption and MAC separately, or if we do, we have theorems to combine them properly called generic composition. And the recommended solution today is encrypt and MAC. Why? I can now explain it to you. You encrypt first, and then you apply a MAC, and this way you protect your encryption against chosen ciphertext attacks. Okay, because as an attacker, if I modify the ciphertext, I can't modify the MAC, so I will submit a ciphertext for decryption that will be rejected, and I will not get the decryption. So by macking your ciphertext, you prevent an attacker from doing chosen ciphertext attacks on the decryption. So remember, CBC mode is secure against chosen plaintext attacks, but highly insecure against chosen ciphertext attacks. So if you combine CBC mode with a MAC on the ciphertext, it's actually okay. And so this is called encrypt then MAC. So it's used in IPsec, and the recent versions of TLS after 2008, we use encrypt and MAC. Before people thought that MAC then encrypt was better, the idea was, well, you really want to MAC your plaintext because as a user, I don't care about the authenticity of my ciphertext, I care about the authenticity of my plaintext. So that was the intuition, but this is wrong intuition. In cryptography, your intuition can be wrong. So people used MAC then encrypt in the old versions of TLS, and I believe also in SSH. And then also in Wi-Fi standards. And you can also just MAC and encrypt separately, but nobody does that. So people either MAC the plaintext or MAC the ciphertext. And this is the best solution. Now, if you do this, you need 2 independent keys. 1 key for encryption, 1 for MACing. So this is a bit annoying. So people prefer authenticated encryption where there is 1 key used for both. So you just have a function, an API you call, we give it 1 key, and say authenticated encryption. And then what happens is some magic happens, and what you get back is a ciphertext with a MAC, a tag it's called, and this is what you get back for 1 key. So this is the modern stuff. There is many properties. I don't have time to go into them, but all these properties are important. So can you start encrypting? Is it parallelizable? Can you have data which you don't encrypt, called associated data? What about nonce reuse? What about dealing with fragmentation? And so on and so on. So why I show all these items to explain to you why, more or less, we knew in 1990 we should authenticate and encrypt. It took 10 years to find the first schemes. And now we're 20 years later, and we finally think we're more or less done. Okay, it has taken like 30 years to construct those schemes. And it's not because cryptographers are dumb or lazy, it's just it's very tricky. That's more or less the message. Okay, so developing those things and integrating them in communication systems is much harder than you think it is. So in the last lecture, we talked about IPsec. IPsec is network layer encryption. So what you do is you have your packet with upper layer data from the transport layer. You will add a trailer for padding. So you may want to, for example, if AES, you may want to make your message a multiple of 128 bits, or you may want to hide the length of your message and pad all messages, say 2024 bits. And then you actually encrypt the upper layer data and the trailer, and you MAC everything. Okay. But you also MAC the ESP header. The ESP header is the header that actually gives information on the encryption and on the protection being used and which key is being used and so on. So this is the data which is encrypted and MAC'd, and this data is not encrypted, because if you would encrypt this, then the other side doesn't know which key to use to decrypt. Right? This is the ESP header says we use this algorithm with this key. Of course, it doesn't give the key, but it gives a pointer to the key, and it gives more information, the version of the protocol, and so on. So you can't encrypt that, Because then the other side gets random bits and doesn't know how to start. So in fact, this you want to authenticate but not encrypt. And also, unfortunately, in IETF, they call a MAC an ICV integrity check value, but only in the IPsec standard. But if you see ICV, it's just a MAC. So this is explaining why you need associated data. And so more or less the long term is AEAD, authenticated encryption with associated data. That's what everybody uses today. So in the 80s, there were ad hoc schemes. The most famous one is the Kerberos scheme. So I will speak about Kerberos in November. But it was widely used at some stage. It may still be used. It's, for example, still used in Windows Active Directory, probably billions of users. And they made up their own way of getting authentic encryption, which was just a disaster. Okay. Also web. I think I already told you, web is a very good example for students because all the mistakes you can make are made in one protocol. They haven't forgotten any mistake you can make. So then, around 2000, people started developing the theory. And unfortunately, they took patents, some people, and there were conflicting patents. And also, Rogaway, the one of OCB, he says, I don't want this application to be used for military purposes, which of course is a bit of a problem because even Google and Amazon and Microsoft, they sell to the military, whether you like it or not. So if you tell them, here is my patent, you can buy the patent, but you can never use it for military stuff, they say, well, go away. It's very nice to be against war, but this is not how we function. So NIST took a very bizarre decision. So we thought that they would select some of those schemes and pay the people a few million and to be happy. But they didn't. They just say, let's make new schemes, which are not under the patent. So this is how GCM came into being. This is Galois counter mode. There is also CCM. This is CBC MAC counter mode. But CBC MAC counter mode is more robust. But CBC is very slow because it's serial. So this is why nobody wants to use it. And then there were better schemes. But NIST decided to take the worst scheme and standardize GCM and CCM. We still don't know why. And so now people have made different stuff. So there is ChaCha20. In fact, Google likes this. ChaCha20 is a stream cipher-like design together with Poly 1305. Poly 1305 is a GMAC version with integer arithmetic. So it's actually much faster on processors without Intel instructions. It just uses normal calculation with numbers. There is a robust version of GCM called GCM Civ that avoids all the problems of GCM, that doesn't reuse keys. But of course, it's way slower, so nobody uses it. Or it's not widely used. There is more ideas, and then there is Aegis. This is one of my bright students, Hongjung Wu, made this design. I helped a little bit, and so this is now used by Google to encrypt their whole cloud, because it's actually 4 times faster than GCM. It's also vulnerable against nonce reuse, not as badly as GCM, but Google knows how to use nonces. Trust them, they know what they're doing. Okay, so but as you can see, there is still movement there. And so more recently, there was the ASCON lightweight algorithm design that is a hash function and authentic encryption. So this space is still moving, right? It's not that we are bored or we don't know what to do. So now we also recommend to use OCB3 because now there is no patent on it. So again, to show you how tricky this field is, there is 3 versions of OCB. The second version of OCB, they all have security proofs, but the second version of OCB is insecure and has a wrong security proof. And people discovered this only after 17 years. So this shows you just that this is a tricky area. It's the way to compare things. I don't have time to go into the full details, but you can look at this. But it's kind of complex trade-offs exist. That's the main message. So for example, this is a 2-pass scheme. That's why people don't like it. Here are some pictures. It doesn't help you too much. So this is a way to represent CBC MAC, and this is counter mode, right? This is how it looks in practice. It's slightly different representative, but it's just CBC MAC and counter mode. But of course, all the details matter as well. What you put as beginning counter, where you encrypt, what you truncate, and so on. All these details, they matter, of course. Here is OCB mode. Again, you don't have to know those things by heart. It's good that you have seen them once and you can look it up. OCB mode is actually ECB mode. So at the core, there is just ECB, which means block by block. But then you XOR to every block a different constant before and after the encryption. to avoid that patterns are. And then there is a very clever way to make a checksum and encrypt that again as well. And then these keys here that you add before, they're derived actually from encrypting in the beginning from the nonce. So, but the nice thing is you can parallelize this very well. This is why people like this key. So it turns out that once you have a sponge, so once you have something like a large permutation, you can actually also make it into authenticated encryption. So I told you you can make a MAC, but in fact you can also do authenticated encryption. It's not so difficult. It's called a duplex. So you start with all zeros. You put your message in here, padded, and then you apply the permutation. Here it's called F instead of pi. And then in fact you take some output bits which you XOR to the message to encrypt. And you keep doing this block by block. And at the end, you output some state, and this is your MAC algorithm, your MAC value. So it's, again, the fine details are tricky, and how you prove security is tricky, but it's just a very simple way to take a simple object, a permutation, that just maps 512 bits to 512 bits, or 1600 bits to 1600 bits in the case of CatCheck. Just a random mapping, and then you can use it in a simple way to actually, so I think why I wanted to show this is not to figure out why every detail is like this, but that this design is a lot easier than this design. And you can imagine that if you have this design that after 15 years people find a security problem and a bug in the proof, here I think the proofs are much simpler and because the designs are simpler. Okay, it's a simpler object. So as I mentioned, we like competitions. There's Olympic Games for us. So NIST didn't want to do a competition on the data encryption. We thought there was one needed. So we also run in Europe a competition for stream ciphers between 2005 and 2008 or 9. And then NIST paid somebody some money to run an informal competition for authenticated encryption called CESAR. Most of the efforts and design was, again, if all the names are either European or people from Asia who studied in Europe and moved back to Asia. And there is a very strong community now, for example, in Singapore. And so here is the winners of the competition of CESAR. So there was Aegis. This is design from Hong Jung Woo. There is OCB there, and there is also ASCON, which is actually also the winner of the NIST competition. So after the NIST lightweight competition, and so ASCON is now a new design that people, I think, will start looking at more in detail. So this is the lightweight competition, and so the winner was announced February this year, called ASCON. But also here were several designs from our team as well, but this time we didn't win. But this actually, ASCON, this is our Graz office. So both Vincent and myself, we were professor in Graz. Vincent was there longer, and we trained a new generation there. So now they're also doing good cryptography. So now I'll explain to you why Google likes Aegis. So this is performance in cycles per byte. So how many cycles you need to encrypt a byte. And so you see, if you do counter mode, this is no authentication. This is just encryption, which you shouldn't do. Then the performance, this is the blue curve. This is as good as you can do. This is, of course, using Intel processor with AES instructions. Right, so you have special instructions to implement AES. If you use CCM, so this is counter mode with CBC, you see if you have short messages, it's 7 cycles per byte, and for long messages, it goes down to 5 cycles per byte. This is why nobody likes CCM. GCM is this. So it gets a bit better for long messages, but it's also not very good. And so as you see, Aegis, the two versions of Aegis actually, as soon as your messages are around 200 bytes, they're as fast as counter mode itself. So you get more or less your authentication for free. And so you can actually encrypt on 0.66 cycles per byte. This is in a bridge, Sandy bridge. Now there is better processors and it's even faster because Intel keeps speeding up those instructions as well. Okay. We're supposed to break, but we'll skip it. I hope you find that okay, because I have to give a talk in Brussels to a company on post-quantum cryptography. They asked me what to do with the post-quantum migration. And they want me to give a talk at 1 o'clock, so I'll have to drive very fast. No. I'll tell them I would be a bit late, but I will stop a bit earlier, and no accidents have to happen, and I can stick to the speed limits. So that's more or less the development. So I hope I didn't confuse you. You still remember the main principles. There is hash functions, and there is max, keyed and unkeyed. Designing a hash is tricky. The NSA is incompetent. We trust them anyway. That's the main message. We use SHA-2. Everywhere is SHA-2. And there is SHA-3 coming, which uses permutations. And then you have also max. And max, there is more or less two schools. You take the block cipher or a stream cipher or hash function which you have, and you turn it into a MAC. Okay? And as the block cipher changed and the hash functions changed, you use new constructions. Or you have this counterpart of the one-time pad. You can actually use simple polynomials, the simplest function you can imagine. But then you should use your key only once. And don't do like GCM and reuse your keys. And then, of course, in practice, you want authenticate encryption. So, in fact, if you become a user of cryptography or you evaluate an application and what they use, you should see only a call to authenticate encryption where you give it one key. And so what you find in industry today is a lot of GCM because that's been in place since 15 years now. But you will see migration towards this Poly 1305 CHA-20. This is what Google and Aegis. These are things Google are pushing because Google cares about performance. And of course, if Google pushes something like this, then the others start copying after a while, right? They see, oh, this is faster. And Google tries to have standards, and so then they copy it and do similar things. But it still keeps moving. And also in practice, there is like, a gazillion properties to look at. It's not so easy to make a choice. It depends on performance, robustness, parallelizability. Do you need hardware? Do you need software? So unfortunately, finding a good solution is not as hard as before, but it's still a complex choice, right? It's like I guess one way to understand is that you now are a specialist in authenticated encryption. What is a specialist? Somebody who knows when to call an expert. Okay, so you understand now why the problem is difficult, and you should just not throw random darts and pick your scheme, but it actually depends on many aspects. Okay, let's move on to signatures. So MACs are for Alice and Bob who trust each other. Signatures are for the real open world where anybody can be malicious. So you have interactions with other players. And anybody can cheat on you. And more or less what you want is you want evidence. You want to be able to go to a judge who decides who of the two has been cheating or has been corrupted. And you also don't want to share secret keys with everybody. Imagine that Microsoft would have to share a secret key with every user before they could send a code update. There would be only one solution. They would hide the key in the code. The same key for everyone would be easy to use, but then you would find the key and make it public, and then it's game over. So you have to have a different key for everybody. This is kind of a nightmare, right, to how to deal with this. So this is why all update mechanisms also use signatures and not MACs. So, and if Alice and Bob have different keys, then actually a judge can say, okay, Alice did it or Alice didn't do it. Because if Alice and Bob have the same key, well, if a MAC shows up, the judge has no idea who did it if they disagree, right? They both have the key. There is a message, there is a MAC, but you can't tell whether Alice or Bob did it. In signatures, only the owner of the private key can sign. So we'll look at RSA. There is also, so Diffie and Hellman, I mentioned this, they only found key agreement, not encryption. They also couldn't find a signature scheme. So RSA, MIT beat them. But then Hellman had a brilliant student a bit later. So in '85, El Gamal showed actually how you can easily make with discrete log both encryption and signatures. And encryption I showed you already. Now we'll show you signatures, or maybe after our lecture break. By the way, you can also construct signature schemes using SHA-2 or AES or RIPE-MD 160, whatever your favorite hash is. And so this is now one of the most important new developments. So schemes exist since the 70s. They've now been optimized and standardized. So you can actually build signatures based on hash functions only. And they're post-quantum secure. So they're also secure even if your opponent has a large quantum computer. So the schemes are slower, and the signatures can be huge. So signatures can be 10 or 20 kilobytes compared to 128 bytes for RSA, so it's kind of 26 bytes. So the industry is not happy, but this is now one of the things where we're migrating to. And this is a new evolution, but we don't have time to cover everything, so I just point that out. So RSA, just a reminder, if you use RSA for signing, you take your message, you raise it to the power secret exponent d mod n, and you find the signature. And how do you verify? In fact, you raise the signature to the power e mod n, where e is the public key, m is the public key, and you find m. So we call this signature with message recovery, which is very nice because if you verify the signature, at the same time, the message comes out. Okay? So you don't need to have the message and a signature, but you just have a signed message, and if you verify it, as part of verification, the message comes out. Now, there is problems with this. First, the eth root of 1 is 1, and the eth root of -1 is -1, so people use exponent 3 all the time. So the third root of 1 is 1, because 1 to the third is 1. So you have to make sure that, again, your message is random. It's mapped to a random element between 0 and n-1. Now there is another problem. I can just pick a message as star. I pick my message as star, and I say, oh, I have a signature of Alice. Let's verify it. So I take S star, I raise to the power E, where E is the public key of Alice, mod n, where n is the public key of Alice, and I find the message M star. Okay? I do this equation here. And I now claim that Alice has signed M star. Now, if S star is random, you raise it to the power E, you get something random. So now you can say to Alice, you signed a random message. Is that bad? Yeah, maybe not, but it's kind of annoying because Alice never saw this message. And the judge will say, oh yes, it's Alice's message because, I raise it to the power E and I get M star, you signed this. The point is, if you know some mathematics and you're clever, you can even make this M star have certain structure and be text or have zeros in the right places and so on. So it's a big problem and we have to solve it. A third problem is something which we find fantastic because RSA is homomorphic. It's a difficult way of mathematicians to say that RSA of a product is the product of RSA operations. So this is very nice because, for example, this allows you to count votes if you do e-voting. And you can, in this case, you multiply votes, but there is also tricks to add the votes while they remain encrypted. So you collect all the votes, and then you apply this property, and then you obtain the sum of the votes, and then you can decrypt, so you never see the individual votes. So this is very cool, but for signatures, this is very annoying, because you first sign message M1, then you sign message M2, and now you also sign their product, while you never thought what their product would be. And for 2 messages, it's okay, but if you sign 10 messages, then there is 2 to the 10 combinations. So in fact, if you sign 10 messages, you actually signed 1,000 messages. So we have to do something about this, and the answer is you have to encode your message first. So you have to first apply transformation to M into M bar, and then you sign M bar, and then the recipient will actually raise my signature to the power E mod N, and will check that this M bar is a correct encoding of M. So you have to check the structure, and the idea is if you pick now a random S prime, then this M bar will not have the right encoding, and so you can reject the signature. So that's more or less the solution. So you have to add structure or encode the message before you sign. Okay. This is, for example, use this mechanism in credit cards because what they sign is your public key in a certificate, but they don't want to have the public key and the signature. That would take too much space in the credit card. So they actually encode the public key in the signature and they save space. So this is nice. It only works for short messages of less than 100 bytes. And so people made quite some mathematics and attacks and studied, and after 3 years of work, they made an ISO standard where you said you first put 0, then 0, 1, then FF, then the message, then the hash of the message, then more derived from the hash of the message. So in fact, here you would actually like to have a XOF, so you would like to have a very long hash value here. But at that time, it didn't exist, and then you put 6. And there is even a math reason why you put 6 and not 5 or not 3. People felt very happy about this. So with XOF, you could actually just put one hash and make this hash as long as needed. So today we would do this easier. Unfortunately, this has been broken. So people showed, in fact, that even with all this structure and all this hash stuff and whatever, you could still somehow take several signatures and produce new signatures. Okay, so EMV still kept their scheme because they believe the attack is not so practical. So to launch the attack, you need to do about 1,000 billion signatures. Now, these signatures, in the case of EMV, have to be made by a CA, by a certification authority. Now, go to a bank and say, can you please make 1 billion signatures for me so I can break your signing scheme? They're not going to do it. Okay, that's what the EMV, Visa, Mastercard said. It's okay, we can deal with it. But this scheme has been abandoned. So signatures with message recovery, you will not find anymore. So what you do is signatures with appendix, as I showed you before. So you will first hash the message to a short string, and then you will sign the hash only, so you have only a short signature, and it's much more efficient because you don't have to sign megabytes with a slow algorithm. And the other side, you recompute the hash, you take the signature, you apply the RSA operation, and that's it. Okay. We're not done yet because, of course, if you think about this, we just looked at hash functions, and they have 256-bit result or 512-bit result. Now, your Belgian EID card has an RSA modulus of 2048 bits. I still have to tell you how to map these 256 bits to 1024 bits. And the first thing you would have is maybe padded with zeros, right? Bad idea. So ideally, you would like to have what we call full domain hash, a hash function that maps to 2048 bits. We now have it called XOF, but until recently we didn't have this, and also the Belgian EID card, for example, designed in 1999, didn't have this feature. We'll come back to this. But so now you also can understand why we need collision resistance, because imagine, and this is an attack that the NSA has done against Microsoft, imagine that you want to circumvent Microsoft systems. I don't know how much you know about computers, but one important object in computers are device drivers. So every time you create a product, a webcam, a mouse, or whatever you plug in, you have to supply device drivers so that the operating system can talk to this thing. And it's a very important source of blue screens, says Microsoft, and also of malware. So what if you if you write a device driver and you want to have it approved by Microsoft, Microsoft will look at it, will check it for bugs, will check it for malware, and then will sign it. And only if it's signed will Windows install your device driver. So what is now an attack which the NSA did, and this slide is older than the attack, but the attack was discovered in 2013. You write a nice device driver, which will pass the test, and you write a device driver with malware. And you make sure that they collide under your hash function. This case was MD5. So you find two distinct inputs with the same result, the one with nice code and the one with malware, and you give the one with nice code to Microsoft, who looks at it and says, this is fine, here is the signature. And you can now upload it and spread it over the world, and everybody will happily use your device driver. And of course, what you spread now is the malicious version, and now you control all the PCs. So this shows you that actually, if you use a hash function in a signature scheme, it has to be collision resistant. If you can find collisions, then you can ask somebody to sign one thing, and they signed, in fact, the other thing. The theory people in cryptography say, oh, but you have to always randomize a message before you hash, and then you solve the problem. So you just pick you have random bits, and you put them in front, then this will not work, this attack will not work, which is correct. But what if somebody inside Microsoft is malicious? Then they pick also this 128 bits, and then this doesn't stop the attack. So it's better to find collision-resistant hash functions. So what do you do? So I explained the problem that this hash function, like in the Belgian EID card, used to be 160-bit. They use SHA-1, now they use SHA-2, 256 bits. So you put a hash identifier, then you put 00, they put FFFF, and then 1000, and this is what you actually sign. Okay? Now, if RSA is secure, you can't forge or compute random ETH roots. Last time I looked, this doesn't look to me like a random number. Right? It's full of ones or Fs. So in fact, there is no way you'll ever be able to prove that breaking this signature scheme is the same as breaking RSA. But the industry says, well, this is what we do. It's now been approved, it's been certified. So I said in '99, I said, over my dead body, will you implement this in the Belgian ID card? Because it's really a scheme you can't prove secure. The industry said, that's all we have. That's our certified solutions. By the way, this standard is from 1991 or 92. And a better standard was created in '94. If you take the Belgian ID card today, it still has a 92 standard. Because the companies still say, we have a certified implementation of this first crap thing, and we can't change it because it costs us too much. That's how things, the same thing as MD5, and so the reaction is, can you do an attack? It's not, do you have a security proof? It's, can you do an attack? And of course, people have been trying, and they haven't managed to find an attack, so then they don't change anything. But it's not a good scheme. I hope you understand that. It's not difficult to understand. This is not random, so it can't be good. But it's impossible to kill because there is no attack. And in industry, what counts is euros. Right? Changing this will cost millions and millions. And if there is no attack, why should they change? And if there is an attack, they will say, why didn't you tell us? Have we told you? Yeah, but that was just an academic paper. And so that's the debate we have every day. So EMV, this is Europe Pay Mastercard Visa. They also use, they actually use a clever trick where they combine this. They also write part of the message here, so it's called partial message recovery. So it's kind of a hybrid in between the two. So they have a hash and they have some bits of the message here as well to make their certificates more compact. It's also not very secure, but just good enough. So what should you do? Well, there is a solution called RSA PSS. PSS is the abbreviation of provably secure signing. And there is a security reduction, a proof that if you can forge a signature, you can break RSA. And more or less what it does, it encrypts the message with a block cipher based on a hash function, so a large block cipher, where the key is public and fixed. But then what happens is the message looks random, and now the security proof goes through. Okay, it's the cost compared to an RSA operation is like 1,000. So it doesn't really slow things down, but you have to add extra code and check it, and so it's not being widely implemented. But so this is how, in practice, things work. This is also why universities sometimes break stuff, because if you don't break it, it doesn't change. Even if we say the design is not good. And the other thing, as you now heard several times, changing legacy is very hard. You heard the DES story, the MD5 story, the PKCS version 1.5 story. Also TLS still used this for a long time, until I think 10 years ago. So it's very hard to kill legacy because it's expensive. And if you work in a company and you tell your boss, we have to replace this, your boss says, what does it cost? Yeah, 5 million. Is there an attack? No, but Bart Purnell says it's not good. 5 million because Bart Purnell says something is not good. Go away. Do something useful with your time. Right? That's more or less how the conversation will be with your boss. Because money is money, and this is how people think about things. This is also why I think that this post-quantum will be a very big challenge. Because again, for companies, this is $1 billion investment for large companies, and the computer has not been built. And the threat is a problem in 2040. Who cares about 2040? All the people in management will be retired, and they will be somewhere in the Mediterranean in a yacht. So why should they listen to you and do something? They can also spend the money on their bonus or on some other cool new product. They can also try to solve a problem for 2040, but if you try to convince them of this. So the only ones who listen are governments and banks, because banks are, and they're regulated. So the regulator tells them, you have to do something about this. Okay, so final thing for this morning is, it looks very complex, and you will need some time to process it. You really have to try it yourself. How to turn discrete log into a signature scheme. It's very cool. So more or less you start with the setup. Again, you have a generator alpha, which is 2, and a prime p, which is standard, and can be the same for everybody. You have a private key x and a public key y is alpha to the x mod p, just like Diffie-Hellman. This is an easy concept. And so given y, it's very hard to find x, especially when p is 2,000 bits, 3,000 bits. And again, in practice, we do the same thing, but in a different group called elliptic curve, but the mathematics is different, but the concept is the same. If you want to sign a message, you make a new key pair. So in fact, you generate a random k, so a new like secret key k, and you compute alpha to the k mod p, and then you generate a temporary public key r, which is the first part of your signature. Okay? And there is an extra condition on k. It should be relatively prime with p minus 1. You'll see right away why. And now my signature consists of r, this is the public key, and s is the solution of this equation. Alpha to the hm is the hash of the message, is equal to alpha to the xr times alpha to the ks mod p. So what you see here is x is my long-term private key, r is my short-term public key, k is my short-term private key, and s is the signature. Okay, you have to solve this equation. Now, if you already looked at the part in the course on the mathematics of public key cryptography, or if you took the course discrete applied algebra, you will know you can solve this equation by writing the exponents not mod p, but mod p minus 1. Okay, because alpha to the p minus 1 is 1 mod p. So in the exponent, you calculate mod p minus 1 and read the extra material if you want to find out why. So you can write this as h of m is xr plus ks mod p minus 1. And this you can solve. It's a linear equation. We, as a signer, you know, of course, x and k. You know r because we just computed this. So you solve this for s. And so s is hm minus xr times k inverse mod p minus 1. And so this inverse only exists if k minus 1 has no factors with p minus 1. This is why you have this extra condition. But in practice, p minus 1 is 2 times a prime, so you just make sure k is odd, and this prime p prime is very huge, so it will never happen anyway. So in practice, you just have to check that k is even. So it's actually this is a slow computation, but you can do this in advance because it doesn't depend on the message. And this is a very fast computation because it's just a few multiplications and an inverse mod p minus 1. So it's much faster than exponentiation. Okay. Now, of course, the magic is how do you check this equation? And that's the magic of El-Gamal. So in fact, it turns out that alpha to the hm is equal to y to the r times r to the s mod p. So in fact, you can take this equation and rewrite this. Alpha to the x is equal to y. So alpha to the x is equal to y. And alpha to the k is equal to r. So I replace alpha to the k here by r. And so you see that magically, this equation now only has green values and black values. The red values are out there. I can check this equation with only the public values. Okay? So I just got rid of alpha to the k and alpha to the x and alpha to the k. And I have here an equation which a signature is rs and a message. So if you have r and s and the message and the public key y, you can actually check the signature. You really have to try this yourself once. So maybe you should start from this and figure out how you can sign. Or you start from this and you check how you can verify and try to cover the other part and try to figure out whether you can find it. It's not so difficult, actually, once you get the hang of it. So, El-Gamal, for every signature you need a new key pair. So you need a random number generator in your device, which you don't have for RSA. For RSA, you can have deterministic signatures. This means that you need a random number generator. And for example, Sony in their PlayStation. So I think I told you factoring was done on Sony because Sony was allowing you to root their machines and they subsidized the hardware. So the cheapest way to do calculations was buy 1,000 Sony PlayStations subsidized by Sony and not game on them, but actually do computations on them. That was 12 years ago the cheapest way to do stuff. Then Sony got a bit unhappy with this. They lost money. So they made it impossible to run Linux or something else on their devices. So they had stopped code updates. And they did code updates protected by El-Gamal signatures. But they always chose the same K. So they decided it was too difficult to do a random K. In their signing operation in headquarters in Tokyo, in their special signing module, they were too lazy to choose a new random number every time. So they chose the same K all the time. Now, it's a good exercise to figure out why this is insecure, but I can give you a hint. if you write this equation for multiple messages, but with the same k and r, you just get linear equations which you can solve for the long-term key x. So every signature gives away a linear equation in your key, but it's okay because here there is two unknowns, k and r, but if you keep reusing k, in fact you get two equations in two unknowns with two signatures and it's game over. So the hackers quickly were able to solve the Simon key and be able to root Sony PlayStations again. And I went to Tokyo afterwards to give them a course on secure implementation of cryptography. It was very interesting. So if you can break discrete log, you can break the signature scheme, obviously, because then you can find x from y. But solving this equation for r, maybe you can choose s and then solve this for r, but again, we don't know how to do this. You can also choose r first, and then it's a discrete log problem again. But we don't know actually how to solve this, so we believe it's secure. But what Bleichenbacher showed is actually that if alpha or p are chosen maliciously, you can actually forge signatures. So you have to trust the party that chooses alpha and p. Okay, so I think something we wondered was, we wondered in the 90s, like, why did El-Gamal come up with this equation? And then some people actually say, oh, but I can make a variation of the equation and I can still make it work. And it turns out that, you have here lots of variables and you can put them in lots of configurations. And in fact, in most cases, you have a secure signature scheme. So in fact, the question is not, how did El-Gamal find this particular choice? It's just that any choice more or less works. There is some that don't work, obviously. But in fact, you can make any choice, and then you get a variant of El-Gamal. And so people even patented all these variants, but those patents have now expired. I like it very much because at the exam, I can make up a new equation, and I can ask you to show it's a signature scheme and to show you how to verify it. And so you have this slide next to you, but still you have to understand the principle and not memorize what has to be done, right? So in fact, there is a gazillion variants. This looks like very especially crafted, but in fact it turns out that almost everything works. But this is the real El-Gamal. Now, the US government didn't like El-Gamal, but I will do that next time. You can look at it already if you like it, but the US government was worried because El-Gamal can be used for encryption. They didn't like RSA because it's used for encryption. So they made a new standard called DSA. DSA cannot be used for encryption. And it has shorter signatures. So they use a trick. You have a subgroup of mod P of order Q, where Q is a prime dividing P minus 1. And so in practice, it was 160 bits. So the US government made a standard DSA where the key was, or the signatures were much shorter, and the signing was more efficient. The verification is actually more expensive, which is a bit strange because the signature is signed only once and verified many times, like a certificate. But this is what they pushed as a standard against the whole academic community and the industry. And so it never became a big success, but today people use the variant, like for example, Bitcoin uses a variant of DSA called EDDSA, so Edwards curve DSA, elliptic curve variant of ECDSA. So now today it's one of the most widely used signature schemes, but people didn't like it because the NSA pushed something which was used for signing, not for encryption. That was their main motivation for pushing DSA. It was not to help the community, it was to actually stop encryption. But that's politics, so we'll stop here. You now get a long break because next week I'm away, and the week after there is kind of the low intensity lecture week, whatever it's called in English. And anyway, 2nd of November is a public holiday, 1st and 2nd. So we'll see each other in the week on the 9th of November. But that week already, there will be 3 exercise sessions in symmetric cryptography. And so there will be 3 sessions, and you should be able to go to either one of them, but they're not recorded, okay? And more or less, it will be about modes and hash functions, collisions. It will be about the part on symmetric cryptography. You will not do public key. There will be a second exercise session near the end of November where you have to study all the math of the public key cryptography to the exercise session. Okay? Thank you, and see you again in 3 weeks.